Hey everyone, I'm Ben, the amateur exegete, and this is episode 71 of Bible Study for Amateurs. Today's episode is Elizabeth Shively's Purification of the Body and the Reign of God in the Gospel of Mark, Part 5. In the last episode, as we continued our look at Elizabeth Shively's 2020 piece, Purification of the Body and the Reign of God in the Gospel of Mark, we asked if the idea that the Markan Jesus rejected purity regulations held any water. We also asked what evidence we had that such regulations were important in the time and place in which Jesus lived. It is to that question we now turn. In his book, The Origins of Judaism, an Archaeological Historical Reappraisal, Yonatan Adler, an associate professor at Ariel University in Israel, offers two categories of evidence to support the notion that purity concerns were relatively widespread in ancient Judea, including the time during which Jesus lived: textual and archaeological. He begins with Philo, a contemporary of Jesus of Nazareth, albeit one living hundreds of miles away in Alexandria, Egypt. Described by one historian as the most eminent representative of diaspora Judaism, Philo was a Greek-speaking Jew whose writings offer us one of the few literary glimpses into Judaism of the late Second Temple period. He wrote on a variety of subjects, from the life of Moses to treatises on virtues to inebriation and more. He even composed a Q&A on the book of Genesis. Important for our purposes are references to the ritual purity system found within Philo's impressive literary output. Adler observes that the Alexandrian discusses impurity related to sexual intercourse, gonorrhea and skin diseases, and more. Additionally, Philo speaks of how things like lepra were to be treated, especially the mixtures of water and ash used to render the impure pure. But Adler offers a cautious note regarding Philo's commentary. It is somewhat difficult to know whether Philo wrote any of this from personal familiarity with these rituals as practiced by Judeans in real life, or whether he was simply paraphrasing and interpreting Pentateuchal regulations whose actual observance he may have never experienced. This caveat aside, Philo at least offers us a glimpse into what some Jews were thinking about purity regulations. It also allows us to draw an inference, namely that if purity regulations were a concern for a Jew as far from the temple to Yahweh as Alexandria, Egypt, then it was surely a concern for Jews who lived in close proximity to the cult in Jerusalem. The next piece of textual evidence Adler discusses is that of the New Testament. For example, in Mark chapter 7, the Pharisees and scribes interrogate Jesus as to why his disciples do not follow the tradition of the elders by washing their hands before they eat. The evangelist offers an explanatory note in verses 3 and 4, describing the practice of washing as one performed by the Pharisees and all the Jews. Writes Adler, "For our purposes, it is less important to understand precisely what it was that the writer here intended to convey regarding Jesus' own views on ritual purity practices than it is to note the manner in which all the Judeans are depicted as adhering to these rules. Regardless of whether this story actually took place as described, if at all, the writer here clearly believed that it would make sense to readers to have regular Judeans portrayed as actively concerned about the ritual purity of the food they ate, and as commonly practicing purificatory rituals mandated in the Pentateuch, and even expanding upon these rules in order to ensure the ritual purity of their bodies, utensils, furniture, and food. And Mark is not the only gospel wherein Jewish concerns about ritual purity serve as important background data. In the Gospel of Luke, for example, Jesus' family is depicted as faithful to Torah, having Jesus circumcised on the 8th day following his birth, offering a sacrifice for purification in accordance with the law, and even celebrating the Passover every year by going to the temple in Jerusalem. Similar material, which has the ritual purity system as background, can be found also in the Matthean and Johannine Gospels, as well as the Acts of the Apostles. The final piece of textual evidence Adler mentions is that of Josephus, the Jewish freedom fighter turned historian in Roman employ. Per his autobiography, Josephus was of noble lineage, claiming that his father Matthias was a very eminent man, and his mother belonged to a line of Hasmoneans. Additionally, he depicts himself as precocious. While still a boy, really about 14 years old, I used to be praised by everyone because I was book-loving. The chief priests and principal men of the city would often meet to understand the legal matters more precisely with my assistance, he wrote. As an adult, he became a prolific writer, composing lengthy tomes on Jewish history. His writings, like those of Philo and the New Testament, come down to us in Greek, a language which he confessed he found difficult to pronounce correctly, though he clearly had no difficulty writing in it. One of the many topics to be found in his writings is that of ritual purity. Adler notes how Josephus discussed issues surrounding lepra, sacrifices related to childbirth and sex, and even the ways in which Jewish sects like the Essenes interpreted and put into place the purity regulations of the Torah. Some of the stories Josephus tells even require purity concerns as part of the narrative groundwork. For example, in his autobiography, he recalls going to Rome at the age of 26, after a group of priests and other associates of Josephus were arrested and taken to none other than Nero himself. Ultimately, he is able to secure the release of his countrymen, writing that these Jewish prisoners, even in wretched circumstances, had not abandoned piety toward the deity, but were subsisting on figs and nuts. Why figs and nuts? Adler thinks it has to do with Leviticus chapter 11, verse 34, which forbids the consumption of any food that came into contact with unclean water. Because these Jewish prisoners could not have known whether their Gentile captors had used water that was ritually pure to make bread, they would have sought out food that was not stored in potentially impure water, but was kept dry. Fruits and nuts, then, would have been regarded as unsusceptible to impurity, and hence permitted, even if obtained from Gentiles. Adler has provided us with textual evidence for purity concerns in and around the time of Jesus. But what about archaeological? That is what we will explore next time. That's all the time we've got this week. See you next time, and remember, in the words of Richard Elliott Friedman, one does not need to deny what is troubling about the Bible in order to pay respect to what is heartening. Thanks for stopping by.